おはようございます。今日の朝のHoudini作業配信を始めていきたいと思います。今日は、前回やったのが、MOPS っていうモーションオペレーターなのかな。モーショングラフィック用のオペレーターのプラグインを入れたので、せっかくなんで、それをもうちょっと使ってみようと思い、いい動画があったので、それをやっていこうかなと思います。では動画流します。
As a final project for the first sprint of Houdini in 5 minutes, we're gonna build this very popular ice-aligned tactical shooter style map. And we're gonna use a combination of standard Houdini tools and a few MOPS nodes. So let's get started by dropping down a grid, which is gonna form the basis for our terrain.
画面見えてなかった。こんな等高線っぽいようなやつなんですが、この辺のラインに沿ってパーティクルが張ってるやつが、MOPS を使ってやってるのかなと思います。はい、では、Houdiniのバージョンは 18.5 です。これその価値読み取る中にいた。MOPS ってやると、こんな感じで、オペレーターが増えてます。ここのシェルフにも、この MOPS と MOPS ツールっていうのが入っていて、セットアップすると、こんな感じで使えるようになります。そんなにセットアップ自体は難しくないので、もし動画で興味持っていただいた方は使ってみるといいと思います。はい、ではやってきます。
So let's get started by dropping down a grid, which is going to form the basis for our terrain. Let's dive in there, and let's increase the rows and columns to say 400 by 400, so we have a decent resolution grid, like this. In order to make that into a terrain, we're just going to cheaply use the mountain sub, which will attach to it, and then scale the height as well as the element size. So we are ending up with something.
あとバージョン19からマウンテンノード完全に消えたので、もしこうチュートリアルとかマウンテンが出てくるようなチュートリアルとかをやってうまくこういう形状が作れないみたいな時は、バージョン下げて 18.5 まではちゃんとマウンテンあるんで、形状下げるか、もしくはどれだっけ、テキストポートか。テキストポートで CD のテキストポートでシェルとかを使ってる人は割と感覚的に使えると思うんですが、Houdiniはもうこのヒップファイル自体が階層構造になってるんで、ディレクトリの中を探るような感じでこう入っていけまして、この GO1 っていうノードの中にいるので、ここで OP アドのマウンテンってやると、普通に19でもマウンテンノードを作れることは 確認できてます。なので、そうしていただくといいかもしれません。ちょっとやってみるか。で今これ19起動したんですが、ジオメトリー作って、ここでマウントをミスった。マウント、U がいらない。マウンテンってやると、なんかアイコンは今までのやつがそのままで、なんかそのまま出てきそうと思うんですが、もう完全にアトリビュートノイズという別のオペレーターに変わってます。で、さっきみたいにテキストポートから CD の OBJ の字をで、ペアドのやると、生きてるので、作ることはできます。自分はあんまりここの機能使ったことないんで、使ってないので、そこまでちゃんと分かってないんですが、ここで作れるのは、正式な多分名前でしか作れないので、マウンテンってやってアトリビュートノイズが作られることがなくて、多分アトリブノイズとかやらないと作られないんですよ。なので、マウンテンってやって作れたら、マウンテンっていうノード自体が存在してないとそもそも作れないので、裏側にデータがあれば作れるっていう感じなんだと思います。アトリビュートノイズも地味にバージョンとかがあったりするので、はい。じゃあ、動画に、作業に戻ります。はい。
Like this, decently detailed terrain for our case. Next, I want to build those individual lines to form those strings along which the particles will wander. And for that, I will intersect this mountain terrain here with a bunch of other grids. So let's drop down another grid, make this maybe 20 by 20, so it's way bigger than our terrain, and I only have 2 rows, 2 columns, so it's a single polygon like this. And it's bigger than the mountain, which we can ghost here. And I'll create a bunch of copies of that grid, and for that, again, I need to create a few points, this time using a line, which will have its origin at -1 along the y-axis. The direction along the y-axis is perfect. Let's scale it up to a length of 3 and make it maybe 20 points. We're going to wire both into a copy to points, the grid as well as the lines, so we are getting this stacked grids here. And now let's wire both into a boolean. And the boolean in Houdini is really fun because it's rather reliable, spitting out decent geometry and resolving most of the intersections that we feed it. So let's wire in the mountain as well as the copy to points, and on the boolean itself, let's set its operation to seam, to detect the seams where these two geometries intersect. And after a short calculation, we are getting this. And on the boolean itself, let's set its operation to seam, to detect the seams where these two geometries intersect. And after a short calculation, we are getting this. And let's unghost the mountain. These are just those individual iso lines of our map. So that's one element of the setup of the effect that we're building. Next, let's use a similar technique to build those individual terraces. And for that, again, I'm going to use the Boolean with a bunch of copies of a grid to intersect a version of this mountain here. One that's been actually extruded, so it has some volume, some thickness. So let's create that. Let's take that mountain here, and let's create an attribute on it, which is going to be a point attribute. It's going to be a vector, so of size 3. And the default value will be 1 along the y-axis. And we're going to call this one n for normal. Let's wire this in here, and we're seeing these normals are kind of screwed now. We're going to fix them in a second. For now, we just need them as extrusion direction for our poly extrude node, which we're going to append to the normals that we just created. And then let's move this thing, but not along the primitive and edge normal, but along the point normal, and we're going to use the existing. Point normal that we created. So we're moving this straight downwards. Let's move this down to, say, -4, and also check output back so it closes this mesh here. So we now have turned this mountain into a volume. Let's append a normal sop again, just to fix those normals that we just manually input there.
そういうことか。あ、そこ下に伸ばしたからか。
Like so. Alright, we're gonna use that as one input of our Boolean. Goes in the first slot. And let's copy this here, these 3 nodes, which will form the second slot of our Boolean. However, I want a bit of a higher subdivision for my terraces. So instead of only making like 20 copies, I want to make 80 copies in this case. And I want the number of points here dictating how many copies. copies I'm making to be driven by this first value that we're inputting here in the main line here. So let's right click on that, go to copy parameter, and then to our second line, let's just delete this and paste a relative reference. So that's basically a link to this line's parameter. And let's just multiply this times 4. So when I click out of it, this turns green, and as soon as I click on the name here, I can see the value. All right, in the Boolean, we want a and as soon as I click on the name here, I can see the value. All right, in the Boolean, we want this first input here, my terrain, to be treated as a solid, and this input here, the intersection.
OBS 切れてた。GPU 負荷が高いか。
Intersection planes be treated as a surface. And now I want to subtract B from A, so the intersection surfaces from my volume. And when I click on the Boolean, it takes a while, but it'll spit out those. Individual planes here with a wrong normal. They are pointing in the wrong direction. That's fixable. Next, we're going to drop down a poly extrude, append that to our Boolean, and the distance that we actually want to extrude those surfaces is equal to the length of
ラインじゃなくて、そうで薄切りしたみたいな感じか。それと、このセットアップもめちゃめちゃいい。
this line that generates our points, which we then use to copy those grids, divided by the number of points. So let's create an expression in here instead of having to manually dial this in by going to our line, right-clicking on its length, going to copy parameter, back to our poly extrude. Let's delete this from a distance, right-click in this field, go to paste relative reference, and then again onto our line. Let's right-click on those points, copy parameter, back into our poly extrude, and in here we want to add a division by the
分割をすると、して80割る3割る80。
the relative reference that we just copied. And now we're making sure that this distance between each terrace is exactly the same distance as the distance between those points on the line that we're using to cut up our original terrain. We could just for good measure append a normal SOP again, which of course goes here after the poly extrude, this to vertices, and maybe dial in a cusp angle of 22 degrees, like so. Alright, so let's drop two nulls, one here and one there. Call this one out underscore lines, wire our boolean into it, and the normal goes in this null here, which we're going to call out underscore. Boolean into it, and the normal goes in this null here, which we're going to call out underscore terrace, like so. And now it's about time we create those animated particles that move our terrace, which we're going to do. And now it's about time we create those animated particles that move along those lines here, which we're going to do using a few MOPS nodes in the next video. If you guys like what we're doing and want to support us, Rock Studio. To set up the particles for this animation here, I want to
今日は3部構成なので、引き続き2つ目の動画に行きます。
I want to take our previous setup and focus on these lines that we just built here. Let's highlight our point display, and we can see that these points are distributed kind of irregularly. So let's fix that first. Wiping down a resample node, which in this case I'll wire in before the out underscore line so we can take advantage of this. And let's dial back the length to say 0.02 in our case. And also down here, let's treat the polygon as a subdivision curve, smoothing it slightly. So now we have decently resolved lines. Let's set out the particles by maybe using a sphere as a particle. Let this be a primitive that that's right, and let's wire this in a MOPS instancer. Highlight it, and yes, the sphere is a bit big, so let's dial. Back its scale to 0.01, and also let's set the instancer's distribution not to be distributing on a grid, but on a mesh. And let's just take this mountain node here and drag it into this template object slot here.
Oh.
So now we're scattering our copies, our instances, onto this mesh. Let's drag this down here and make sure that we are scattering 2000 copies here, like so. Next, I want to vary those individual copies' size a bit, in this case using a noise fall off, which I'll wire in after the instancer, and all I want to do is increase the frequency here. so it undulates a bit stronger, 250 along each axis. Next, let's drop down a MOPS transform modifier.
って値が入るんだね。形状が変わるとかではないのか。
Wire this up, and I want to use my fall off that I generated with modifier. Wire this up, and I want to use my fall off that I generated with the noise to just uniformly scale my individual sphere. On a MOPS transform modifier, wire this up, and I want to use my fall off that I generated with the noise to just uniformly scale my individual spheres. And let's just for demonstration purposes.
あ、これね。そう。フォローがまたよ。
Is to just uniformly scale my individual spheres. And let's just for demonstration. With the noise to just uniformly scale my individual spheres.
ああ、そういうことか。理解できた。ランダムで生成するのね。
And let's, just for demonstration purpose, scale back the overall sphere here that I'm feeding in, and I can see I'm getting this slight variation in size here. So again, uniform sphere scale on the sphere that we're feeding in, 0.01, and in the transform modifier, let's set the scale to 0.05. So I just created a bunch of instances of our sphere, slightly different in size, so let's move them along our resampled curves here. And that's the main reason why I'm using MOPS, because there's a really easy to use node in there that makes this task rather straightforward. So under the MOPS modifiers tab, we have the MOPS move along spline, which takes in the MOPS instances here and a spline on the second slot, like so. Let's highlight this, and immediately you can see we're getting some stuff that we don't want. And that's because the move along spline currently is set up to select the curve by primitive number, so instead let's use the nearest curve, and also let's just use distribute as an attach method, like so. Now if we toggle real time and hit play, there's nothing happening because this is not animated yet. So let's go to the Animate tab. And yes, one thing that we could do is keyframe this goal U here and thus animate all those individual spheres moving there. Or we could just switch the mode to Solver and then just hit play. And this is moving really fast, so let's dial back on the speed here. Let's use a speed of 0.02 and maybe
なるほど。ソルバーにしないとアニメーションしないのね。そっか、こういうシミュレーション走ってんのか。なるほど。
maybe randomize this a bit, like so. Let's reset this, play again. Maybe still a bit fast, so again, let's dial this back, like so. And that is looking nicely. So rather straightforward way to attach and move those individual objects along those splines. Finally, for rendering, if I middle mouse on this, I can see that I've got those instances here now with lots and lots of attributes. And I might want to clean that up before feeding this into a render engine, as it might be a really good idea to render those spheres not as actual spheres or instances, but purely as particles, which we're going to do in the next video. If you guys like what we're doing and want to see terrific and prepared in the previous video, to finally set up this animation for rendering, let's just use the setup we prepared in the previous videos. Again, let's add another null to this one here, which we're going to call out particles like this, pipe this in here, maybe highlight it. So as I mentioned, in this case I want to render this as particles and not as instances. So I've got to take
ああ、そうとこれ別にマージするわけじゃないのか。見えるだけなの。ストって何だ？アクセラレーション。
care of deleting a few things that are on my data stream currently. For one, I only want to keep points. That's one of the most counterintuitive things in Houdini. You're gonna use the add node to delete geometry and only keep the points. So let's wire this in here and check delete geometry but keep the points, resulting
そうか、スフィアのデータが残っちゃってるのか、これ。うん。
In this GeoStream now only having points. Then there are quite a few attributes which I don't want and need for rendering. So let's get rid of them with the attribute quite a few attributes which I don't want and need for rendering. So let's get rid of them with the attribute delete, which I'll wire in after the add. And before deleting these attributes, let's have a look at what I want to keep. And that is definitely p-scale, dictating the scale of the particles, and maybe MOPS fall off. Anything else can go. Same goes for the strings. Same goes for the primitives here. So let's delete everything that's on the
PTID が残ってるな。どこでセットされたんだ。
Same goes for the strings. Same goes for the primitives here. So let's delete everything that's on the primitives. Little mouse on it, that worked. And let's delete everything that's on the points. So yeah, we're now only left with P, the position. However, I want to exclude something from it, and that's done with this hat symbol here. So I want to exclude p-scale, and also I want to exclude MOPS underscore fall off. Little mousing on this again, and yes, that's what we're left with. Next, let's randomize these points colors using the attribute randomize. Set to CD for color, let's wire this in here, and I want the distribution to be just two values basically, one white, which is fine, and the other one, let's dial this in to be a rather nice red with the very least amount of green mixed in, like so. And maybe let's make the probability value of B, so for white lights, a bit higher, 0.55. Okay, I highlighted this null here, so that's what's going to be passed on to the OBJ context here, and added this null here, so that's what's going to be passed on to the OBJ context here. And as I want to render this in Redshift, for the reason I already mentioned in previous tutorials, let's, under the Redshift Particles tab, check Render Object as Particles. However, how am I going to render my terraces and my lines? Well, for that we're going to need two more geometry nodes, so let's drop down 1, 2, call this one Lines, and this one Terrace. Let's dive into the terrace here, and let's access the data that we generated in the other node for this terrace using what's called an object merge, which can access other geo-objects, geometry stream. Let's select my grid 1 and the out underscore terrace here. And I might want to move that down a bit using a transform, and just along the y-axis, when I middle mouse on this, I get this ladder. Let's just translate this downward a tiny bit, like so. Okay, up one level, and do the same thing for the lines. So in here, dropping down an OBJ merge, which we're gonna point to our grids nodes out underscore lines. Accept that, and go up one level. Let's zoom in a bit to check, and I could move down the terrace a tiny bit more, so maybe like that. In order In order to render those lines, under the redshift tag, under strands, I have to check render object. And in this case, I want to render them as either a box or a cylinder. Let's take a cylinder, and I don't want to tessellate them. That means further subdivide them. And let's just ignore the p-scale attribute and just dial them in using the default scale. So let's set that to, say, 0.002 maybe. Let's just quickly drop down a redshift dome light and a redshift render op. Again, leap down a redshift dome light and a redshift render op. Let's just quickly drop down a redshift dome light and a redshift render op. Again, closing all these tabs here, pinning this tab. Then Control T twice to get these 3 tabs, one for the out context, one for the materials context, and one for the OBJ context. In the dome light, I'll just link up an HDR. And this is a very dark HDR because it's an unlit studio. So So let's just control click on the camera. So we have a camera. In the scene, let's lock that to the viewport and go to the render view and dial in our render. Immediately we're seeing a few things. Let's just increase the HDR's brightness first, then
死んでる。使える HDRI か。ダメ、もしかして。たまに使える HDRI がねえな。これいけそうか。これでいいか。
And those particles are way too big, so let's decrease.
でかすぎるとしてもなんか絵が変なんだよな。なんかちゃんと出てない気がするな。
Decrease the global scale multiplier. It's looking a bit better. I'm seeing those particles here. The lines come through nicely. And on my HDR, let's just as a quick hack increase the gamma and maybe the intensity.
HDR が違いすぎて全然調整が揃わないな。
As a final
これを HDRI 合わせることにしました。やっぱ全然違うな。
Intensity. Let's just reposition our camera to maybe something like.
ガンマ上げちゃダメだろ。揃わないんだ。こっちもしちゃう。パーティクルが全然見えないんだよ。
This, and on our dome light, let's rotate this so this is a bit backlit. Let's create a few materials. Using our Redshift material builder. In this case, for the let's create a few materials using our Redshift material builder. In this case, for the terraces, I want something with only a slight bit of reflection, maybe for the terraces, I want something with only a slight bit of reflection, maybe quite darkish color and a slight blurriness, but I want to increase reflection, maybe quite darkish color and a slight blurriness, but I want to increase its IOR, so the overall activity is increased a bit. Let's go up one level. Terrace. Copy it twice. Call one particles and the other one lines. For lines, I'm going to dive in here and just select the glass preset here. And for the particles, I'm just gonna load the glass preset here. And for the particles, just gonna look up their point color. So loading in point attribute here, which I'll pipe into the diffuse color, and also in the overall emission color here. Nope, I use the out color like so. And in here I want to look up not the UV tangents, but CD color diffuse. Just make sure we have no reflection going on here, and in the color diffuse. Just make sure we have no reflection going on here, and in the overall tab, let's increase the emission power to 5. Alright, let's assign those materials. Grid, those are my particles. So under the render tab, let's select the particle. Material terrace, that's gonna be my terrace material, and the lines will be my lines material, like so. Let's refresh the rendering, and we can see those individual particles appearing there now. Alright, everything else is dialing in your material's values. In this case, my terrace material is way too dark, the reflection is way too glossy on it, my light is coming through only a tiny bit, so I'm not gonna step you through all of this. I will provide you with a scene file that is set up for rendering in Redshift. And if you're interested into learning more about rendering, we've got a premium course running on that currently on our Patreon, so you might want to head over there. And apart from that, it's the usual. If you
暗すぎるな。ラインが全然見えねえな。 まあいいや、この辺の微調整は後でやろう。一旦動画は終えたので、まあ、今回は前回やった MOPS というプラグインを使った作例をちょっと再度やってみました。結構この辺の等高線みたいなののラインプラスこう厚みがあるみたいなセットアップは他のにも使えそうな感じだなと。本当はラインの時はシームを使っブーリアンのシームで、こっちはサーフィスのサブトラクトみたいな感じでやれば多分、大体のやつ同じセットアップでこんな感じのものを作れそうな気がしますね。あとやっぱりこのラインに対してパーティクルを沿わせてアニメーションさせることができるこの MOPS Move Along Spline っていうノードが使い勝手良さそうだなと思います。こっち側はなんか取り立ててそんな複雑なことはやってなさそうなので、インスタンスあってこれメッシュ以外も選べるのかな。ちょっと相も変わらずやっぱりレンダリング周りは、難しいですね。やっぱ HDRI とかでも使う HDRI だとも全然できる絵も変わってきますし、このライトのパラメータの調整だったりとか。まあでもレッドシフトに関しては、基本的にパーティクルかラインかみたいので、この辺のオブジェクトのタブでセットアップ切り替えてあげるっていうのが基本なのかな。パーティクルストランズ、ボリュームみたいな感じでですね。で、マテリアルも大体レッドシフトマテリアルビルダー使って、中でジオメトリの色使いたいみたいな時はポイントアトリビュートとかで引っ張ってきてみたいな感じですね。またもっとちょっとレッドシフトはまだ全然使ってないのでセットアップ分かってないんですが、複雑なことやろうとするときっとこの辺のシェーダーとかがもっと複雑になるんだろうなと思いますが、レッドシフト結構簡単に綺麗な絵が出やすいので、このぐらいシンプルなセットアップでも十分、最初のうちは十分かなって気がします。というところで、ぼちぼち今日の配信は終わりたいと思います。ご視聴ありがとうございました。